Greetings, APUSH scholars, for our review on Unit 14, World War II. Looking at the review sheet from top to bottom, you should know what America First was. This is a 1930s organization promoting American isolationism. Its most famous leader was spokesman was Charles Lindbergh. The Quarantine Speech of 1937 is a speech in which FDR urges freedom-loving nations to stand united against an epidemic of world lawlessness. And this is aimed at Germany, Italy, and the Empire of Japan. And in this speech, he's challenging the prevailing mood of isolationism. Some efforts to stay out of war before 1938. You should be familiar with the Neutrality Acts of 1935, 36, and 37. The Neutrality Act of 1935 says you can't sell weapons to nations at war. 1936 Neutrality Act says you can't give loans. 1937 Neutrality Act says you can't give sales of weapons to sides in or belligerents in a civil war such as is going on in Spain. You can't travel on belligerent ships, and it banned the arming of merchant ships. And if you look at these three Neutrality Acts, think about what in some ways drew us into World War I. We had become the suppliers of weapons for the Brits and for the French, or military supplies at least. We had given tremendous billions of dollars in loans, and we didn't want these countries to lose and not be able to pay us back. And remember, the Lusitania sunk in 1915 with Americans on it, Americans on a belligerent ship, a ship of a nation that's at war. So these Neutrality Acts were meant to keep us out of European conflict. After 1938, though, you have the 1939 Neutrality Act, which is modified, and sometimes this is called just simply cash and carry, that we're alarmed now that Hitler is so much on the rise, and we still won't make loans or allow Americans to travel on belligerent ships. But the arms embargo was repealed on a cash and carry basis. You send your ship to carry it, you give us cash, no loans, and we'll sell you stuff. 1939, you have the Declaration of Panama, in which a 300 to 1,000 mile security zone is declared off the coast of all of North America and South America to boot. And within this zone, we're escorting British ships. 1940, you have the Destroyers for Bases swap, in which we swap 50 old American destroyers for 8 British military bases, from all the way up in Newfoundland into the Caribbean and down to Georgetown in British Guiana. 1940, you have the Lend-Lease Act. The Brits run out of money. They can't cash and carry anymore because they don't have any more cash. And what this does is it allows loans, quote-unquote loans, to be made, and we'll worry about getting our payment or our stuff back later. 1940, there's a ban on the sale to the Japanese Empire of iron, of steel, of aviation fuel, and machine tools, in part because they have invaded China. In 1940, you have the first peacetime draft passes the U.S. Congress. 1941, you have the Battle of the Atlantic, where the Germans are sinking British ships faster than Brits can make them, and the U.S. becomes involved actively in helping the Brits hunt down U-boats, hunt down submarines. And in 1941, the United States preemptively occupies Greenland with Danish permission, and we occupy Iceland to keep the Nazis from taking either of these two islands as bases. And in 1941, you have the famous Atlantic Conference between FDR and Winston Churchill off the coast of Newfoundland, in which they declare that the principles of war here that are being fought are for freedom and for self-determination, not for aggrandizement. We don't want anything out of this, in other words, and we're not at war yet, but we're signing this declaration. So from the cash and carry to the Declaration of Panama, destroyers to for bases, Lend-Lease, these embargoes on goods again to the Japanese, and peacetime draft, helping the Brits hunt down U-boats, occupying Greenland, Iceland, and the Atlantic Conference. These are all shifts away from neutrality towards greater engagement. And right before Pearl Harbor in 1941, the United States is going to ban the sale of all fuel oil to the Japanese. We're going to freeze Japanese bank assets in American banks. Changes in U.S. society during World War II. As far as taxes go, you have your first withholding taxes taken out of each paycheck rather than a yearly event paying your taxes. You have the sale of war bonds. You have, I put on the review sheet taxes, but I meant taxes and economics. You have the Office of War Mobilization, which is basically going to tell industries what to make, is going to tell the trains where to go and what to move around, and is going to set rationing in the United States. You have the National War Labor Bureau, which is going to work to set wage and price regulations. So the government becomes deeply involved in orchestrating the American economy to produce the material needed to prosecute the war against the Italians, the Japanese, and the Germans. As far as women, you should know that 350,000 women do serve in the military. And the basic principle behind this is free a man to fight. So women become telephone operators. They become secretaries. They do clerical work. Some women are flying, about 1,000 women are flying military planes between bases, flying them from places like Willow Run, where they're coming off the assembly line, flying them to the East Coast and off to Great Britain. But the greatest number of women who are contributing to the war, by 1944, you have 19 million women who are working, and many of them are working on farms and in factories doing the jobs that once were held by men. You've got that iconic image of Rosie the Riveter, the woman who's building planes. And keep in mind, Willow Run, which at one time was the biggest auto plant in the world, converted to building B-24 Liberator bombers. 1 out of 3 women, or 1 out of 3 workers in that plant were women. As far as African Americans go, you should be familiar with the phrase the Great Migration, which actually starts during World War I and between the war years and continues on during World War II. And this is the movement out of the South of African Americans seeking opportunity to escape racism in the South. And the opportunity is being found in largely American industry, which pays better wages. And you don't have de jure, you don't have legal segregation. You do have de facto segregation in the North, but nothing as brutal and hateful and dangerous as in the American South. A. Philip Randolph is a name you should know. He's the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, who's organizing a march on Washington to protest that black Americans in industry are getting less pay. And he threatens this march, and the president gives in, and he issues Executive Order 8802, which says that if you are a factory getting U.S. government military war contracts, you have to pay the same wages to all your workers. And during the war, there's about 1 million blacks who will fight in the war. Remember, you have the Tuskegee Airmen, who are these flyers, and you see them perhaps in that, if you've seen the movie Red Tails, which shows them in combat. Keep in mind the military at this time is still segregated, and you do have black soldiers are under white officers. As far as Hispanics, about 200,000 Mexicans are welcomed across the border as braceros, as workers, as working in the fields doing agricultural work, but there are Hispanics that are moving into factory jobs as well. As far as Native American Indians, you've got the famous Code Talkers. About 24,000 Native Americans served in the military, and the Code Talkers are Indians who didn't use encoding and encrypted messages and machines. They just talked to each other over the radio. The Japanese couldn't figure out Navajo and Hopi and Zuni. These languages were, there's nobody who spoke them in Japan. Japanese-American internment. You should be aware that during the war there is a panic, there's fear that there are saboteurs and spies among the Japanese-American population, and 110,000, about 2/3 of them are American-born, are thrown into prison camps, internment camps, concentration camps, relocation camps, whatever you want to call them. It's not like the German prison camps where people are being tortured and killed, but these are basically, they're being imprisoned for the duration of the war. A term, the Isai are the first-generation immigrants, and the Nisai are those 2/3 who are Americans, and their constitutional rights have been totally ignored. There's no charges, there's no jury, there's no trial, there's no lawyer, there's no habeas corpus here. These Japanese are thrown behind barbed wire in camps largely through the American West. Korematsu versus the U.S. sees Mr. Korematsu is an American citizen who sues, saying that this is unjust, that he's been interned, and the Supreme Court rules against him. And the argument, what it's called exclusion or internment, is upheld in 1944. And the argument of the Supreme Court is a lot of people are making sacrifices. There's close to 15 million American soldiers who are in harm's way, putting their lives at risk. And, there's people who are actually dying. And the Japanese Americans just need to sort of suck it up and, endure their hardship for the sake of the common good. The Allied primary war aim after December 7, 1941, is to defeat Germany. At this point, the Germans have attacked Russia, the Soviet Union, in the summer of 1941, and we have the Battle of Britain going on, this relentless pounding of British population centers. And the thinking is, even though the Japanese attacked us first, and Germany's declared war on us, honoring their alliance with the Japanese, but the Germans haven't really attacked us short of the submarines. The thinking is we got to defeat the Germans first, or else we'll be all alone if they knock the Russians and or the Brits out of the war. Allied disagreements over military strategy. Russia throughout the war wants us to open an immediate second front in Europe. They want the pressure taken off of them. Remember, this 3.3 million man army has invaded Russia, pounding at the gates of Leningrad, pounding Stalingrad into dust outside the gates of Moscow. The Russians are going to suffer, millions and millions of losses, civilian and military, and they want this pressure relieved. And there's this frustration, this belief that perhaps the Americans are using the Nazis to sort of bleed the communists to death here. And Stalin is very suspicious that our delay was deliberate. Britain feared a direct frontal assault in France against the German fortress Europe, and he pushed us into agreeing to what's called Operation Torch, and that's landing in North Africa, moving across North Africa, jumping to Sicily in what's called Operation Husky, and then Operation Avalanche is the attack on Italy. The Italians do fold, but the Germans move into hold Italy really till the end of the war. And the thinking here of Winston Churchill is that the Italians are weak, and that if we capture Italy, we can sort of go up through the back door into Germany. Remember, Churchill's the architect of the disastrous Gallipoli invasion, trying to open up the Dardanelles. This is that body of water that goes in between, one of the bodies of water that goes in between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and this was a fiasco. And you also have that Dieppe commando raid on Europe before D-Day, and that was also just a total slaughter of the commandos that landed. So Churchill had a very healthy respect for how dangerous a frontal assault on Germany would have been at this time in 1942. So instead, Americans, British forces land on the coast of Morocco and Algeria in what's called Operation Torch. Main points of Allied strategy in Europe. Well, there's that going through the back door here, Operation Torch, which leads to jumping off into Sicily and then Italy. And then in 1944, you have Operation Overlord, which is the D-Day invasion in Normandy, France, thus beginning really the second front in Europe itself, Europe proper, moving through France and then crossing into Germany. And the D-Day invasion, this is June 6, 1944. In Asia, the sort of a double strategy. There's an argument between Chester Nimitz, who is a naval commander and admiral out in the Pacific, and you've got MacArthur, who's been chased out of the Philippines, and he wants to liberate the Philippines. That's his primary goal. And Chester Nimitz is saying, let's go up through the Central Pacific and aim right at Japan. And basically we have a two-prong attack, one going up from Australia through New Guinea up into the Philippines, and then one which is island hopping across the Pacific under Nimitz. And island hopping is this idea, you don't need to take every island that the Japanese have. You can take every other one, hop over some, and leave them to wither on the vine. And remember, American submarine power is basically just sinking tremendous numbers of Japanese ships. And these islands that are bypassed essentially are cut off. They don't have fuel, they don't have food, and they will wither and die on the vine, to extend the metaphor here. The Manhattan Project is the project to build the world's first atomic bomb, which is dropped on Hiroshima and on Nagasaki. The reason for dropping the atomic bombs was to end the war quickly, was to save American lives. Big editorial comment here. My father enlisted into the U.S. military 3 weeks before the atomic bombs were dropped. He fully intended to be part of the invasion force into Japan. And the thinking was this would be about 1 million American casualties, killed and wounded, based upon the ferocious, the tenacious fighting the Japanese did in places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And the thinking was this was also going to kill millions of Japanese. And these same American subs that are sinking supplies down to these islands in the Pacific, American subs are sinking ships full of wheat from the island of Hokkaido. This is that northern island in the Japanese archipelago. And there is hunger. There is basically some starvation going on in Japanese cities. And where am I going with this? This bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, unless you're a pacifist and say all killing and all bombing is wrong, this was justified, this was necessary, this was good. The Japanese, had sex slavery, had these tens of thousands of women, a lot of Korean comfort women following them. The Japanese killed some 20 million Chinese. The Japanese started this war. And keep in mind, 33 Japanese cities were incinerated by incendiary bombing before the atomic bombs were dropped. Incendiary bombs dropped on Tokyo killed approximately 90 to 100,000 people and left 1 million homeless. So this AP teacher has no tolerance for those who say dropping the atomic bomb was immoral, unless you're a pacifist and you say dropping all bombs were immoral. End of editorial. Okay, where Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and this would be August 6th and 9th. And the Enola Gay is the name of the plane flown by Paul Tibbets. And to round out a few points on the test, I'm going to ask you for a few places are in Asia and Europe. So the places that you had to label earlier in this unit, know where places are. So good luck. Signing out.